the nature of regimes and how they change. And then in the last class, on April 15th, I won't make any statement, and I would like to reserve that class entirely for the ideas and problems that you bring. So I hope everyone in the class will prepare questions and propositions for us to discuss on that day. We won't stay longer than is justified by your engagement. Today I want to discuss what may seem to be central to a study of political economy and of its future, which is politics. And politics has figured only intermittently in our discussion of political economy. And in today's argument, it will be central. Politics, above all, with respect to the institutional content, the way that democracy is to be organized, and in the alternative forms of organization. Now let me arrange my argument about this great theme in three interlocking sets of ideas. The first set of ideas has to do with the way in which the problem of politics and of the nature and the organization of the state arises in economics. The most typical way in which it arises in economics is with respect to the problem of selectivity. Selectivity of subsidies, of tariffs, of incentives, including fiscal incentives or disincentives. So the problem arises typically in the following way. Someone says, in principle or theoretically, it might be a good idea to have differential incentives or disincentives, differential tariffs, or differential subsidies. But in practice, given the nature of the state or the problems of the operation of the state, this theoretical first best will in fact be a second best. It will be a second best because the attempt to differentiate will invariably serve as a vehicle for the enforcement of dogmas or the capture of the state by special interests, by the organized interests of societies. And the result will be a combination of dogmatism with cronyism, or favoritism, or clientelism. And therefore, we must avoid this theoretical first best and treat the second best as if it were the first best. And what is the second best? The second best is to have universal and impersonal rules which abandon the attempt to differentiate. So you can well understand the context in which this problem arises. Famously, it arises, for example, in the context of industrial policy. Because industrial policy, in its traditional versions, requires the state to support certain sectors, which it may regard as the bearers of the future, the sectors of the future. And then the objection that is made is that when the state attempts to choose the winners, the losers end up choosing the state. That's a version of this argument about the link between selectivity and cronyism, favoritism, and also on the other side, dogmatism. So if the surface problem is the problem of selectivity and its dangers, The underlying problem is the problem of the capture of the state or of parts of the state apparatus by the organized and armed interests of society. And of course, that second level problem is in turn related to the fundamental problem, which is the coexistence of a state which seeks to be democratic or at least impersonal with a class society. The uneven, unequal organization of society, with the result that some parts of society are organized and others are not. Some are powerful and others are not. Some are influential and others are not. And that's then the reality which underlies the phenomenon of capture, and which in turn then leads to the critique of any attempt by the state to exercise selectivity. There are then two main classes of solution to this problem of capture, taking the problem of capture as the central intermediate problem that connects the pathology of selection with the enigmas, with the problems that arise from the coexistence of a neutral or a democratic state with a class society. The first solution is weak democracy, a soft democratic state. And that's the solution which, of course, prevails in all the countries in the world that are or regard themselves as democracies. All the democracies that exist in the world are these weak democracies. In the second set of the argument, I'll define more particularly what I mean by weak democracies. So in these weak democracies, in which, to anticipate part of that definition, the people remain at a relatively low level of political engagement or mobilization. So politics has a low temperature. In these weak democracies, the susceptibility of parts of the state apparatus to capture by the organized and powerful interests of class societies seems to be the reverse side of something good and indispensable, which is the responsiveness of the state, of this democratic state, of this weakly democratic state. So the evil of capture seems on this account to be the reverse side of the good of responsiveness of the state to society. The second class of solutions is for the state to be captured by an elite, a political or technocratic elite which exercises, in effect, a dictatorship and claims to speak for the universal interests of society. So then the state says it's hard. It's not soft, it's hard. It resists capture by these differential interests of civil society. And then the problem is that this vanguard in power, this empowered vanguard, will in fact be a victim first of dogmas. It will have its dogmas. And second, of its own power interests, its interest in the maintenance of its power. So the hardness of the state cannot prevent the vanguard in power from subordinating its policies to its own interests, to its interest in the maintenance of its power, and secondarily to its dogmas. And of course, as time goes on, with the likely or frequent degeneration of the vanguard, political power will turn into economic power. This state elite or the groups connected to it will acquire a privileged position. And then after political power is turned into economic power can be turned back into political power. So the attempt to have an authoritarian hard state will regularly fail. So these two solutions, the weak democracy and the authoritarian vanguard, are not in fact as different as they at first seem to be. What then is the third class of solution? The third class of solution is that there be a deepening of democracy. A radicalization of the democratic idea which attacks the contradiction between democracy and the class order and attempts to expunge from society, little by little, step by step, its class character, its character of radical inequality of organization, and then it will be possible to have responsiveness without capture. Well, of course, that's an idealization. That's what we don't have in the world. But if you would take at least the surface problem, the problem with which I started, which is the problem of selectivity and its pathology, that problem is almost universally recognized in economics. And that is typically the starting point, the point of departure for debates in political economy. We can't safely differentiate. If we try to differentiate, we're going to end up with this cannibalization of the state by the unequal and privileged interests of civil society. So this is not very mysterious. The empirical reference to the categories that I'm using are pretty obvious. On the one hand, we have among the two superpowers now in the world, China and the United States. In China, we have the dictatorship of the party. And the dictatorship of the party is opposed to any loosening of its grip on power, always remembering Gorbachev and the disintegration of the Soviet Union. And now, in order to avoid Gorbachev, they've ended up as Brezhnev. That is, they've ended up as this. They've sunk into this combination of dictatorship, dogma, and relation to particular interests in Chinese society against others. And in the United States, then we see how the attempt to reinvent industrial policy, as an example, have a state that promotes the economic vanguard, the new vanguard of the knowledge economy, easily degenerates into a series of subsidies to factions of capital. So if you examine the content of the CHIPS Act, promotes the semiconductor industry, or the Inflation Reduction Act, a large part of it can be seen as a series of handouts, of subsidies to factions of capital, exemplifying the phenomenon of capture. So that's what we have in the world. And that's the beginning of the discussion of the relation of economics to politics, of economic policy to politics. Now you could say in examining the intermediate problem of capture, that the generic solution would be agnosticism about sectors. That is, the state renounces the effort to choose sectors, but affirmative construction of procedures or frameworks. So the state doesn't choose the winning sectors. The winning sectors have to arise from some evolutionary or competitive process. And what is the best framework? The best framework is the one that inspires, permits, or supports a great variety of contradictory, innovative, and entrepreneurial activity, which is then retrospectively subject to draconian competitive selection. And that idealization, which I've just stated, is not very far from what many mainstream economists would say, would acknowledge as their position. The question is then, under what real political circumstances could this idealization become real? And the claim that I'm making is that they are the circumstances of a deepening of democracy, that idealization cannot come to pass in the realities of these weak democracies coexisting with class societies which they fail to defy or to transform. So that's the first set of arguments and ideas which I wanted to state today. And let me stop there and ask whether you have comments. I'm trying to describe the most general way in which the problem of politics arises in the debate about economic policy. Yes?
We might touch on this later, but you talked about how there needs to be a nationalist progressive vanguard to come and sort of take the reins of many people.
When I was speaking about the agent of the growth miracles, and I'm going to come to this later in the third set of ideas today and then back again tomorrow. But the basic, let me remind you of what the basic idea there was. The basic idea is that in the world today, most people, the majority of humanity, remain poor and disorganized in the large populous countries of the world. But their horizon of aspiration, rather than being proletarian in the Marxist sense, is petty bourgeois. What they aspire to initially is traditional, archaic, isolated, retrograde family business. What do the majority of men and women in the world want? What they want is a small plot of land, a little farm, a store, a little business, a trade that they can ply. They're not objectively part of what you might call a petty bourgeoisie, the small business class. But subjectively, they are petty bourgeois. That is the horizon of aspiration. They are petty bourgeois rather than proletarian in the Marxist sense. And the claim I make, to which you just referred, is to ask how, given this reality, this social reality, can growth miracles continue to happen? A very small number of countries in the world have ascended to the first level of prosperity, of growth. How could other countries continue to ascend in this circumstance? And the claim I made was that two things are necessary. The first is something that has always happened in every growth miracle over the last 300 years. And that is that there be a division in the elites between the predominant element, who are characteristically rentiers of financial gains or even of natural wealth, and a dissident counter-elite with a productivist and nationalist orientation. And what is necessary for a growth miracle to occur is that this counter-elite gain power, seize power, and then garner support in the popular majority of those subjective petty bourgeois, and offer them, the petty bourgeois, an alternative to their default option of archaic, isolated family business based on family saving and self-exploitation. And the general category or class of the most promising options today to this default would be somehow to put this vast periphery of production in the world on the road to a version of the knowledge economy. Not the knowledge economy like Silicon Valley, but a sustained rise in inclusive productivity, which, for example, can begin in the agriculture sector, the agrarian sector. It's not restricted to advanced manufacturing. So if you have a country like my country in which we have monoculture of soy and low-intensity cattle grazing, with the result that much of the national territory is degraded pasture land. The alternative in the agricultural sector would require intensification of ranching, less cattle per acre, diversification of crops, and above all, progressive industrialization of the agricultural and ranching products on the basis of advanced science. And there are states in the world that already have the organizational instruments for this lift-up operation. What they don't have is a project which would allow them to use these instruments to best effect. So that was the idea to which you were alluding. And of course, it's connected to this, yes.
Could you just sort of help precisely define how we're using capture here?
How the state is captured?
Yeah, yes, and the reason I ask that is I'm trying to sort of conceptually, even as we get into the sort of third solution, understand
Well, of
how
course,
we can sort of
yeah.
avoid capture. Is that even conceptually
Well, of
possible?
course, the conception of capture, I didn't seek to define precisely because it's a conventional conception. In American thought, in American law, its most conventional context is the capture of the administrative agencies, the New Deal administrative agencies, by the industries that they're supposed to regulate. So the personnel is taken from those industries and is planning in the future to go back to those industries. So then the connotation of the idea of capture is that this idea of arm's length regulation is a sham, because it's the regulated who are in fact guiding the regulators. And their interests and their ideas are predominant. That's this phenomenon of capture. And you might say, from a standpoint of a larger sociology of this, you might say, how could it be different if the society is very unequal and very unequally organized? How can its radically unequal organization not manifest itself in this differential ability to influence the conduct of the state? That's the background of the phenomenon of capture. And then the claim is a soft democratic state that is pliant and porous on which these interests of unequal civil society can impose their will is not the adequate solution. But it's the alternative to the other thing, which is the dictatorship of the elite technocracy, of the engineers. Yes.
In a context of great power competition, and specifically technology competition between the
Yes.
US and China, say, wouldn't this sector agnosticism lead to an uncompetitive economy against a Chinese economy, for example, that's heavily subsidizing specific sectors? Doesn't that great power
Yes,
competition?
of course, and that was, of course, that was part of what we witnessed in the Soviet Union and part of the whole interpretation of the Soviet experience. So the American economists said about the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union basically collapsed because its growth was the result of the accumulation of inputs rather than of the rise of productivity, which is another way of saying what you just said.
But that's not the case of the Chinese. What I'm arguing here is that
Well, it's not totally the case of the Chinese, but it's more of the case than is comfortable for China. That is, China is trying to avoid that fate in order not to fall into the Gorbachev of this, and that was my reference to Brezhnev. That's, it's uncertain how far away China is from that other fate. But your idea is that great power competition would impose a restraint on this clientelism?
what I'm saying is, how could you feasibly achieve the sector agnostic ideal in a context of great power competition, where you have your competitor heavily subsidized in sectors? If you allow your economy to roam free and select the most competitive sectors by the virtue of the market in a global market, that would basically mean that you would potentially lose the edge in every important competitive sector.
If you're sure that certain sectors are the sectors of the future, right?
Yes.
But look at what's happening right now in the United States. There's a fever, there's a rage about artificial intelligence. So if you read the newspapers, it seems that the spontaneous animal spirits don't require any enhanced attention to these sectors. They're
That is
already
not-
totally fixated on them.
If I may, that is not entirely true. So there is a huge role for state support in the development of AI. For example,
Of course.
subsidizing data centers.
No, this is separate from the question of whether the state has a mission in the development of these sectors. So the state is already preoccupied with this. And the American state, through DARPA, the instrument, the organizational instrument of the Defense Department, has always been preoccupied with the development of advanced technology. So, and in an earlier class, I said that when war came, the Second World War, the Americans put aside all of their ideological dogmas and ran the economy in a completely different way. And they would still do that. So I think you're right in the sense that the degree of great power, the ferocity of great power competition has a clear consequence for these dogmas. And clearly for any dogma that the state can or cannot do this or do that, of course. Yes.
So, whereas you presented these two powers, China and US, I was curious to know about the politics, the economic policy, or which is at the mercy of political will in countries like Brazil and India. How would you space these larger democracies in the context for
Well, I think that, of course, the clash of the great powers is above all a danger to everyone else because it puts the world on the road to war. But it also, at the same time, creates opportunities to play these powers off against each other and to impose conditions for access to the national economy. So, for example, the Chinese want radically to increase their participation in South America to gain control over agricultural resources as part of their national policy of food security. And the tendency of the South Americans is to simply sell what they have. So they don't have a strategic orientation, but they could have a strategic orientation. They could condition the Chinese presence in South America on the transfer of advanced technology to Brazilian industry, to Brazilian production. They could do with China what China did with the United States, because that's exactly what China did with the United States in an earlier period. So within this system of constraints, there's a large room for maneuver, as I argued last week. Yes.
My question is related. I'm thinking about the conditions of much poorer countries. Maybe let's pick an example like Sri Lanka.
You have to,
I'm thinking of the conditions of much poorer countries, so maybe not India or Brazil, China. So is it possible that they can overcome decades or I don't know, decades of extractive relationships to, you know, is deepening of democracy able to go above this constraint that is seemingly so fixed?
well, you asked that question from the standpoint of someone who doubts that they could, right? So develop your skepticism. Expound your skepticism. Explain it.
I mean,
I think your skepticism would be widely shared. But I'm not contesting you. I just want you to take the opportunity to unpack your thesis.
okay, so from my point of view, and I'm from Kenya, so maybe this is why this is the position that I take. I think colonialism took a huge toll in how countries were able to even join the global economy. So they joined at a very, they were already designed to be laggards from the start. They were designed to be dependent on multinationals, on more powerful states like the US, China.
They were designed. What do you mean they were designed?
I don't mean design. I mean like structurally, the conditions that were there after colonialism were extremely difficult to overcome.
So they chose that, right?
They didn't choose them. I don't think countries chose to be colonized, and if so, for instance, if I were to pick Kenya, which becomes independent in 1963, by 1963, so much in the world has already happened. There's an industrial revolution in Britain, in Germany, Europe, basically. By that time, the IMF, World Bank, GATT system, they're already set in place.
Yes.
Countries in Latin
Well, I
America.
think the story is more complicated. I think that you take, for example, IMF conditionality as an instrument of the pseudo-orthodoxy of neoliberalism. They delivered themselves in chains. It's not that someone came there in gunboat diplomacy and chained them. Their elites in control of national life, of the government, tolerated a very low level of national saving, public and private, deliberately relied on foreign saving, opened the capital account. This was what I described last week as the functional equivalent of the gold standard. They did that by choice. So South Korea and Taiwan did something completely different. Now, of course, you can then go into their histories, into the nature of their societies, and see why this is certainly the path of least resistance, if not for the country, at least for its elite. Because that's how the elite had always lived, as an intermediary between foreign capital and national capital, selling its influence, selling off the country. That's what they've always done. But, so then you can say, well, obviously it's easier for them to continue doing that. Seems to me that's what the argument turns on. But it's not as if there was some fate which required them to always be that way. I don't think so. Now, we have a very interesting situation in Brazil, because Brazil was one of the countries you mentioned. The Brazilian state, for various reasons, reasons of historical reasons, has a whole panoply of organizations which could serve as instruments for the lift up of the economic periphery. So they have Embrapa, the agricultural assistance organization, opened up the subtropical savanna to agriculture. 70 years ago, it was regarded as impossible for agriculture because of the nature of the soil. And Embrapa developed the science of agriculture in the subtropical savanna. Today, the subtropical savanna in Brazil is one of the great agricultural dynamos of the world. And Brazil rivals the United States as the largest agricultural producer and exporter because of this organization. The state has development banks, including the BNDES, which is much larger in its budget than the World Bank. They have networks of technical schools, Senai, Senac. So in other words, they have a vast range of organizations which were created in the previous episode of import substituting industrialization under the Vargas regime. Now, many of them have been corrupted or perverted because they're not enlisted in the service of a project, of a productivist project. But they could be quickly rescued and turned around if there were a state with a developmentalist agenda, a productivist and nationalist agenda. So then the discussion turns to the question which is implicit in your challenge, which is how likely is it that a dissident national counter-elite with a nationalist and productivist agenda could come to power in a country like Brazil? And I think you'll always have to say that it's always unlikely, but it's not impossible, right? So this is back to the discussion of the path of least resistance. The path of least resistance is always the most probable outcome. The path which puts least pressure on the ruling interests and the established preconceptions. But it's never the only outcome. And the opponents of the dominant solution have something going for them. What they have going for them is that the potential of the alternative is not tapped by the dominant solutions. So Brazil between 1930 and 1970 was one of the fastest growing economies in the world, if not the fastest. Now it's completely stagnant. So stagnation is the proof that this has failed. It's been stagnant since the 70s and 80s. And the only reason why it doesn't fall apart completely is that agriculture, ranching, and mining continue to pay the bills of urban consumption. So there's an easy way out. The easy way out is reliance on the natural wealth of the country. But this is a precarious situation which imposes a tremendous price, and a price which even the elites end up paying. And now there's a different social reality, because in every real society, things keep changing. We have 80 million evangelicals who have a culture of self-help and initiative and are unresigned to this traditional politics of handouts. So the country's divided. It has had, the right had a disastrous leadership, mismanaged the pandemic, but even then it almost won the election. The difference between Lula and Bolsonaro in the presidential election was tiny. How could this have happened? It happened because it's a new country, and the country does have these productivist aspirations, even though their expression there is in favor of this traditional form of isolated family business. So it seems to me that in that reality, one can imagine there's a large space for debate that would resist this kind of fatalism. Our history sets us on the course of submission. Well, not always. Many who have submitted have later revolted. So that's the argument. But I don't want to interpret you as an advocate for fatalism. Any further comments?
So basically, it means there's a whole lot of churning and work to be done at the nationalist level, because if inequalities all over the world in pockets or in different countries, whether democracies or not, I mean, today we're talking about democracies, so it means a whole lot of action has to occur at the national level and the international level.
Indeed, the nation state in general remains the decisive seat of action. That's where the action is. I mean, there is some role for global governance, but it's entirely secondary to what happens in the decisive theater of action, which is national politics. Yes.
I guess I'm struggling to understand what the role of government would be in the case of the expanding power of firms at the technological and productive vanguard, for example, other than the legitimate exclusive use of violence by governments in the world where there's a global marketplace. What would the national state be able to do without economic
The national state would
power?
be able to do, it seems to me, the core of the mission of the national state with respect to development would be the lift up of this vast periphery to bring it closer to the vanguard.
But assuming that the state itself is captured by those firms, then other than hard power, I could see, you see this in instances of.
No, but wait a minute, I thought you were asking what would its economic role be, not what could it do politically.
Right.
And so the fact is that the state, as I just said, take the Brazilian case, the state has all these instruments. So if it had a coherent project, it could do a lot. It would have to save these instruments. The problem is that those instruments are now not enlisted in the service of a project. So it has all these instruments created in the era of import substituting industrialization. They're not orchestrated to produce this lift up. So then there has to be a group in power that has this idea. Now, it's a fantasy unless the country can be brought along, can be persuaded. So those 80 million evangelicals with their culture of self-help and initiative have to be converted to an idea that goes beyond the idea of just leave me alone in my family business. That's the default idea.
That point is taken. I guess I'm wondering from, the right, the hard power side, I can understand oppressing a firm with too much power, but on the left, I guess I'm struggling
What do you mean oppressing a firm?
Well, for example, in China, oftentimes, if people are doing extremely well, they're the national champions, and that's fine, but if they try to become politically active, then that's not okay, and maybe they'll be undermined or
Sure, of course.
apprehended. But like in the United States context, I don't see too much ability for people to really push back against the system if the system's captured. And then in the Brazilian case, I really appreciate, but I feel like that maybe, because you mentioned already, it's bailing out the society, but I feel like that's maybe on the margins if the industrial part isn't also brought to a better place.
Do you think that's not possible in the United States?
Not without like a really big systematic change. I see that if a power,
Because in the United States, of course, there is this tremendous knowledge economy, which is insular, it's perverted in all sorts of ways, but it's a huge motor of innovation. And so the question is, what is its relation to the rest of the country? Now, then it appears on the scene of national politics and national policy in this diminished form of subsidies to factions of capital. Build me a semiconductor factory in Arizona, which is one of the things they now propose to do. So it's not that these things are bad, they're the inadequate or insufficient forms of something that might be good, so long as it could be pushed in a more inclusive form. And of course it has educational counterparts. There's a productive element, an educational element. It has a spatial implication because everything in the country, this more inclusive knowledge economy would have to be distributed. So it seems to me to be a whole agenda for the Americans. And in each country, of course, it would be very different. I mean, if you have a large country, the different regions are the crucial area in which to develop the project, because the national project can only live if it touches the ground of regional reality. So that's, I gave in an earlier class the example of the Amazon. So people talk about sustainable development in the Amazon. But what does it mean? Either it means artisanal craft production, like the native populations taking rubber out of the trees, or it's a highly advanced form of the knowledge economy. And so it requires the invention of everything. Even the elementary technology, so for example, focus on forest technology. The forest technology that exists in the world evolved to manage homogeneous temperate forests and not heterogeneous tropical forests. So the forests necessary to sustainable management of a tropical rainforest doesn't even exist, and people don't realize that. So everything would be required, everything we have to, this is a huge national project in which you have to define the general objective, and then it has to have its regional instantiations in each region of the country. So you say, in each of these regions, the country, Brazil, would have a second chance to reinvent itself without having to become first an imitation of the Sao Paulo of the mid-20th century. It doesn't have to pass through the belated purgatory of a late-coming import substituting conventional industry in order later to become something else. So there's a lot of ambition, and it's very practical, because this kind of regional policy then has to connect with the interests and activities of the emergent elites, the productive vanguards of these different regions. But that's not what the traditional politics is about. The traditional politics is about handouts. So in a country like Brazil is not very different from a large part of the world. In Brazil, until recently, until the emergence of this evangelical right, every politician pretended to be a center leftist. And the universal language of politics was the social. social Christian, social liberal, social democrat. Everyone was a social something or other. And if you ask what was the social? The social was the sugar, which they proposed to distribute to sugarcoat the economic model.
In India, it is rice.
And then they face a country in which a large part of the country no longer wants sugar. It wants something else. It wants instruments. So they're taken aback. Huh? So I think that I think the general point is that reality, these social reality seems impenetrable when viewed from afar. But come up close from the perspective of action, and you discover contradiction. And contradiction is opportunity. So the perspective of the observer is always fatalistic. This is the contemplative and ironic perspective. The perspective of the agent is the perspective of hope. Hope is not the cause of action. Hope is the consequence of action. Because you can act for indignation or ambition or any reason. But then by acting, you discover possibility. Well, it's far from our theme. But so this is the first set of arguments or ideas. The second set of ideas then is about the content, the institutional content of this notion of the third option, right? One option is weak democracy, porous, susceptible to capture in the class society. And the second option is the vanguard claiming to speak for the universal interests of society and imposing a dictatorship as the instrument of this claim. The third option is the radicalization of democracy, the deepening of democracy. And I'm going to characterize now its institutional content at a point far removed from the present day. But when I begin to go into some of the details, you'll see that each of the elements of these institutional alternatives has expressions in debates and innovations that are already taking place in the world. Nothing is unfamiliar. So I say, all the democracies that exist in the world are weak or flawed democracies. In what sense? In the sense that they do not facilitate the repeated practice of structural change. Second, that they do not organize a form of political life that lends itself to ongoing transformation. Because our situation now in the world is we're like the liberals and socialists of the early 19th century in the sense that we have reason to affirm the primacy of structural change over non-structural change. But we're unlike them in the sense that we also have reason to resist their structural dogmatism. Each faction of the liberals and socialists had its fetish. They say, organize this way, organize that way, and you'll be free and rich forever. And we don't believe that. So it's not enough to have some solution that's definitive. It's necessary to have a set of arrangements and practices that allow us to continue developing the way along the way. The most important attribute of a set of institutional arrangements is that it lends itself to revision in the light of experience. And third, what characterizes a strong democracy by opposition to a weak democracy is that it weakens the dependence of change on crisis. So the rule in weak democracy is that no trauma, no transformation. And trauma comes especially in the two extreme forms of war and economic collapse, of war and ruin. And the result then is to affirm the rule of the living by the dead. So a strong democracy is a democracy that weakens the dependence of change on crisis and overthrows the rule of the living by the dead. So there's three sets of institutional innovations that are crucial to the content of a high-energy democracy. The first is an elevation of the temperature of politics. By the temperature of politics, I mean the level of organized popular engagement in political life, political mobilization. The premise of conservative statecraft and of conservative political science is that there is a hydraulic inverse relation between institutionalization and mobilization. So mobilization contradicts institutionalization. This is the premise of Samuel Huntington, for example. And in an earlier class, I said, in a lighthearted spirit, that it's like the idea that at the end of the day, you have to choose between Madison and Mussolini. That you either have a politics that is cold and institutional, or you have a politics that is hot and anti-institutional or extra-institutional. What this denies is that you can have a politics that is hot and institutional at the same time. And this is no small matter. Because what is ultimately at stake is our idea of the relation between structure and spirit. So in this debate, Madison and the Romantics are on the same side against the alternative that I'm defending. Because the Romantic assumption is that we're only fully human, we're only really free in those interludes when struggle shakes the routines, structure. The mob in the streets against the bureaucratic routines of the state. Romantic love against the routines of married life. That's when we're free. So Romanticism is a form of despair about the possibility of transforming the relation between spirit and structure. A form of despair about our chance to create structures that are more hospitable to spirit. So what do we need to affirm? We need to affirm that we can have a form of political life that is hot and institutional at the same time. And what does that turn on? It turns on a series of practical details, all of which are already the object of debate in the world. So the organization of the vote, for example, is the vote optional or is it mandatory? In all sorts of rich countries and developing countries in the world, the vote is mandatory. Now, what does that mean? That just means that everyone has an obligation to vote, subject to a small fine. It's interesting that no country in the world, and there are many, that adopt a rule of mandatory voting, has ever then abrogated this rule. Because the rule of mandatory voting helps create a collective habit, which then is taken for granted. And you can see what an enormous effect we have in the United States, where half of the population votes in national elections and the other half doesn't vote. The electoral regimes are circumstantial in their effect. That is, if you have a country that has a frozen party system, like say Italy, the suppression of proportional representation can have a mobilizing effect. In other countries, it's the opposite. It's the adoption of proportional representation against first past the post voting that will have a mobilizing effect. the rules governing the access of the political parties and the organized social movements to the means of mass communication, to television, for example. That you can't buy television time. Television time is distributed for free to the political parties and the social movements as a condition of the revocable licenses under which the media companies do their business. And of course, the rules governing the relation between money and politics. Political activity has to be socially funded and not privately funded. In the United States, it's viewed as an expression of freedom of expression. The Supreme Court said, money talks. My colleague, Paul Freund, commented, I thought that was the problem. So many things that are attributed to culture, political culture, like the Americans are unpolitical or something. Give me a rule of mandatory voting. Give me public financing of political campaigns. Give me prohibition of sale of television time. And I'll show you how the Americans are just as politicized as the rest of the world. It's not culture at all. It's a series of arrangements created in the United States to enforce this proto-democratic liberalism that they've had from the beginning. So that's the first set of innovations. Innovations regarding the temperature of politics. The second set of innovations has to do with the pace of politics. And the principle is simple. Karl Popper, the philosopher of science, said, the point in science is to make mistakes as quickly as possible. Same thing in politics. The point in democratic politics is to make mistakes as quickly as possible. Accelerate the pace. So what I have to say can be illustrated most clearly in the context of the American constitutional arrangements. So in the American constitutional architecture, which is widely imitated in Latin America, there are two organizing principles. There is a liberal principle of the fragmentation of power, many sources of power in the state, and there is a conservative principle of the slowing down of politics, enshrined in Madison's scheme of checks and balances. The Americans think, mistakenly, that the liberal principle and the conservative principle are naturally and necessarily conjoined. They're not. They're connected by design and intention to produce a political order that inhibits the transformation of society by politics. It is possible to affirm the liberal principle of the fragmentation of power, many sources of power in the state, but to repudiate the conservative principle of the slowing down of politics. And how do you do that? There are many ways in which you can do that, but let me give you one example. Suppose you say, if there is an impasse between the two political branches, between the president and the Congress, either branch would unilaterally enjoy the prerogative to call early elections to resolve the impasse. But the early elections would always be bilateral. So the branch that exercised the constitutional privilege of resolving the impasse by early elections would have to pay the political price of running the electoral risk. So the elections would always be for both branches. by this simple device, it's a very limited institutional change, you would entirely transform the political logic of the American presidential regime. Would transform it into a machine for the acceleration of politics rather than for the slowing down of politics. Now, you might think that under this system that I just described, the tendency would be for there to be elections that are too frequent. But I think the main risk would be the opposite, that this that the branches of government would be reluctant to exercise this constitutional prerogative because it would subject them to the electoral test. So you see, it's interesting. In Latin America, we imitated American presidentialism and the American federal systems. In societies that are much more starkly unequal and divided than the American society. And what happened then? What happened is that the president is a tribune, a popular tribune, who is elected by the masses, promising the sky to the masses. That's how he's elected. And the elites in these countries are always trying to suppress the presidential regime and replace it by a European-style parliamentary system. Because their nightmare is that every 4 or 5 years, some outsider is going to win power and put the country on fire. And they don't want that. They want to concentrate power among the party elites and so forth. So they subject this question to the people, to a plebiscite, to decide whether the presidential regime should be replaced. And the people say no, every single time, because they intuit correctly that this is an attempt at the confiscation of popular sovereignty. So the president is elected promising the sky to the multitude, but he arrives in office and then he discovers that he can't do anything. That he's powerful to punish or favor particular interests, but he's impotent to transform structures. And he's driven to this impasse repeatedly. So then you have this kind of unresolved Caesarism coexisting with the reality of these divided societies. But there's a solution. The solution is maintain the presidential regime for the moment until there is a condition, until it's possible to trust the political parties. But equip the presidential regime with institutional mechanisms for the rapid supersession of impasse. In other words, hasten the pace of politics. Yes?
I think a quick question I have on this, sort of concern on elevating the pace, is how do you reconcile this with having some longer-term projects that really need time to...
Projects of the state
Projects
rather
of the
than of the
state.
government, in other
Correct,
words.
where you have
Yes.
high pace.
Well, that's the question of establishing a consensus, right? But I don't think that the way to do what you want, which is also what I want, is to throw sand into the gears and to make everything go more slowly. I think the way to do it is to struggle for the idea that a development project or a defense strategy of the country cannot be the project of the sitting government. They have to be a project which transcends government. And so these two things have to develop together. The idea that there's a long-term strategy which then rests on some kind of longer convergence or consensus, and then there's a struggle among different programmatic directions.
How do you achieve that? How do you achieve any
Oh, it's hard, but I'm sure it's possible. And so, and my experience of this in my own country is the tremendous fascination with this idea of the long term that you mentioned. And a multitude, a mass of young people want to work on this. So it's an idea that has enormous charm, enormous seductive power. And I think that these ideological divisions between the current form of the left and the current form of the right make this harder to achieve, because it's what I, in the earlier class, call shallow freedom against shallow equality. But if you jumbled up the cards in some way, you would produce a basis for this kind of consensus. It's not easy, but I'm sure it can be done. But I think, with respect to this argument, I don't think that the way to come closer to it is to make it harder to change society through politics. And I don't think that slowing democratic politics down deliberately is the way to achieve this larger aim. I mean, this was central to American constitutionalism. The idea that you could immunize the basic order, the social pact of the society, against challenge. Now then, there's the third set of innovations I want to mention has to do with the relation between the center and the local. And in a federal system like the American, the reinvention of federalism. So what's the basic idea? In the conventional conservative conception, there's a pendular relation between central power and local power. So either the center arrogates more power, or the local powers become more powerful. What doesn't go, one goes to the other. But depending on how you shape the division of concurrent and divided powers under the Constitution, you can have both. You can have more facility for strong central initiative and empowerment of local government. And what's the basic idea? The basic idea is, as a country goes down a certain path, it opts democratically to go down a certain road. It hedges its bets and allows parts of itself to deviate from the predominant solution in the country and to create a counter-model of the national future. So a counter-model is much more powerful if it's embodied in something practical, if it's not just an abstract doctrine. So this is the experimentalist idea of federalism. In the Federalist Papers in the United States, the federal system was supposed to be a series of laboratories of experimentation. But the institutional form of conventional federalism is the opposite. It's anti-experimental. So an experimentalist federalism would go through two stages. In the first stage, the emphasis is on cooperation. Vertical cooperation within the federal system between the federal, the provincial, and the municipal, and horizontal cooperation among the states and among the municipalities. Cooperative federalism is the prime instrument of experimentation in public policy. Then there would be a second stage in which you would see the emergence of what I would call wide divergence. Wide divergence is if you have a system in which all parts of the country have to enjoy at the same time the same amount of the right of divergence. The right of divergence can never be very radical. So for the right of divergence to be able to become radical, it must be episodic or localized. So part of a country could apply for a right of very wide divergence with respect to certain issues. And it would have to be vetted by the democratic branches and by the judiciary. Twice vetted to prevent abuse, because we know from the history of many countries that divergence at the state level has been used to oppress, to discriminate, to subjugate. And in this respect, it's interesting that contrary to a wide assumption, unitary states like the United Kingdom or France have an advantage over federations. Because in a unitary state, there's no presumption that all parts of the country must enjoy at the same time the same right of divergence. So for example, in the United Kingdom, the government of the United Kingdom may make a deal with Scotland that's different from the deal that it has with Wales. So that's the advantage that the unitary state has over the federation at the second stage of experimentation. Now, I think the American progressives seem generally to think that of these three sets of innovations that I just described, the temperature of politics, the pace of politics, and the relation of the central to the local, the place to begin is the temperature of politics, and especially the rules governing the relation between money and politics. I think they're mistaken, because these are very controversial in the United States, politically, socially, ideologically, legally. I think the place to begin is the reinvention and re-energizing of American federalism, which is a theme, a cause that has very wide seductive charm in the United States and cuts across the divisions between right and left. But in any event, that's a circumstantial decision. So this is obviously not some kind of blueprint or system, all or nothing. I'm describing a direction for the energizing of democratic politics. And if you look at the direction at the micro level and its content, it's filled with stuff which is familiar. There's nothing out of the world in this. It's not like it came from Mars. But the cumulative and combined effect is to deepen democracy and to create a state which is less susceptible to that dilemma of being either a vanguardist dictatorship or a soft state easily captured by the special interests, by the powerful interests of society. Let me stop there for a minute and ask what your reflections are. So this is what I would call the agenda of a high energy democracy. The general belief of reformers in the world is that the reform of politics and of the state comes first. It's the mother of all reforms. Then you do the other reforms, the social and economic redirection. Again, I think they're mistaken. No country reforms its politics and its state in order later to decide what to do with the reform politics and the reform state. The reform of the state and the politics only happens when it needs to happen. So it's like the idea that the country there's a stranglehold. To walk, to move, it has to invent another politics. So in other words, the struggle over the social and economic direction, which today in much of the world is a struggle over what comes after conventional industry as the locomotive of the economy has to come first. And then it informs this larger struggle over the direction of politics and of culture. That's the natural sequence. Now, yes.
You can clarify the point that, are you saying that in the unitary government, there is no expectation of equal development in all parts of the state?
There's not the presumption in a unitary state that every part of the country, if it diverges, must have simultaneously the same level of right of divergence as every other part of the country. That was the example I gave of the United Kingdom. So there's no presumption that the right of divergence has to be exercised equally and simultaneously, because the practical consequence of that presumption is radically to limit the extent of the right of divergence. And that's the way in which I say a unitary state has an advantage over a federal state. If it can seize this experimentalist potential that I described.
So if that divergence means development, then my understanding is that in the federal system, because there are federating units, so every part of the country, state knows that its own federating unit is responsible for the development in that part of the country. And so there is no expectation from the central government. Whereas in unitary government, unitary state, the expectation is that if one part of the country is being developed more, then probably the other part of the country develops some grievances that we are not being given the same amount of resources and development as other
I don't think it's I don't think it's so much of a question of the amount of resources. It's a question about the direction. So in a large country with great internal variation, like these countries we're talking about, Brazil, India, it doesn't make sense to imagine that there's going to be a single direction for the whole country. So a part of the country, like the Amazon in Brazil, let's say, we're going to give an example of something different, which is an example, it's not just for us, it's a different vision of our national future. Is that not much better? To have like a dialectic of vanguardisms in the country, a conversation of alternative paths. I think that's very interesting.
Sorry.
Yes.
Isn't it more so in a federal government then, because the 10 federating units can at the same time do 10 different experiments?
No, because in a federal government, if you try to impose wide divergence in a federal system, it's not impossible, but it's more complicated. Because the natural presumption in a federal system is that if the states will be allowed to diverge, each of them will be allowed to diverge the same amount at the same time. Otherwise, you have inequality in the federation. There are ways of dealing with that problem, which have to do with the constitutional technique of distinguishing powers that are concurrent from powers that are divided and so forth. The details of constitutional technique matter. And that's true of all these things that I'm saying. So, and I think it's interesting if you take the example that I gave with respect to pace. There the idea was the priority with respect to impasse is to resolve it quickly rather than to perpetuate it. The thrust of the Madisonian arrangements is to perpetuate impasse. If there's impasse, it's good. And why is it good? It's good because it inhibits the transformative uses of politics. These now, there are other constitutional situations in the world that resemble this example. Take the Constitution of the Fifth Republic in France. It has two constitutional times. It has a time in which the parliamentary majority coincides with the president. That's the fast time. and it has a time in which the parliamentary majority diverges from the president. And then the government in power, the prime minister and his colleagues, are responsive to both the president and to this Congress that are pulling in opposite directions. The scheme that I described is like the French system, except that it has no slow time. It only has a fast time. And I think what this illustrates is another interesting feature of institutional design, which is that in institutional design, small changes can have drastic consequences. So it's not like Marxism where you're choosing between capitalism and socialism. You're choosing between particular institutional designs, and the choice is momentous, even though it's small. And that's what I think is so interesting about it. Yes.
On this mechanism around having the central government sort of granting these exemptions or, you know, ability for divergence both
Yes.
in the judiciary and the, like, what's the motivation behind that mechanism versus sort of saying these are the rules of the road and within these
The
rules,
motivation are the objections to dogma. So it goes back to the general idea of how our predicament differs from the orientation of the classic liberals and socialists. I said, like them, we affirm the primacy of structural change, as in the discussion we had about compensatory redistribution. What matters most is not the secondary distribution that we create as a result of progressive taxation and redistributive social entitlements. What matters is the primary distribution of economic and educational advantage and opportunity. Everything else is secondary. So that's the basic reason for affirming the primacy of structural change. But then we say, but we're not like these liberals and socialists of the 19th century, which they said, here's a way, John Stuart Mill or Karl Marx has said, here's a way that you can be both rich and free. It's a scheme, it's a blueprint, and it's good forever. So you commit ourselves to our road, not to their road. We don't believe in that, and we have good reason to believe in that. We've seen too much. We've been disappointed too much. We've been surprised too much. So for us, one of the most important characteristics of a structure is that it not imprison us and that it facilitate its own revision. So in the constitutional arrangements of a country, we would say, we will have decisive action. We will resolve impasse among conflicting parties. We won't allow politics to be what it ordinarily is, which is trying out everyone's second best solution in a kind of rotation. We'll allow decisive solutions. But at the same time, being the contemporaries that we are, with our skepticism, our empiricism, our disillusionment, we're going to hedge our bets. And if part of our country wants to diverge and take another direction and show us a different model of our national future, we'll let it do that. So the reason for that is epistemic or pragmatic. It's akin to the argument for a market economy. Yes?
All of this makes sense to me. I think the part that I'm trying to understand is it's sort of like, so let's say, you know, region X wants to do something totally novel and innovative and, you know, asks for permission from the federal government to be able to do that. If it's like super innovative or super different from what the norm is, then the answer is maybe more likely no. whatsoever, or it's actually something pretty conventional, and so they let them do it. So I'm just understanding how.
It could be. It could be, but I think what you're not taking into account in this statement, which is entirely reasonable, is the cumulative effect on the psychology of the people of the society of this form of political life. Because the form of political life is not the form which says, here we are, we found a safe haven. So this was the American idea. The Americans thought, we discovered at the time of the foundation of our republic the definitive formula of a free society. The other nations of the world must either subscribe to this formula or continue to languish in poverty and despotism. That was their idea. But this is a different idea of political life, that politics is an adventure, and it's an adventure into the unknown. We don't know what the path is. We have our provisional insights, and we understand that everything is risky. We have now a national consensus in favor of such and such a path. But we're not absolutely certain. We could be mistaken, and therefore we'll hedge our bets. And if some of our fellow citizens want to try a different direction, it's in our interest to allow them to do that, because we want there to be a contradiction, a set of alternatives in our country that we can look to. We don't want to just read about alternatives in books. We want to see them embodied in practical examples. That's the argument. It's essentially kindred to the argument for the market economy itself. The market economy is supposed to be an organized anarchy. The problem is the dogmatic equation of the market economy with a particular version of the market economy. That's what we don't want. Yes?
Leaving aside political life and just looking at it from a political philosophy standpoint, what if some parts want to take a divergent course that...
I can't hear you. You have to talk louder.
What happens if the particular divergent part, the majority, wants to really hurt a minority in that particular state? So don't we have a duty to resist that?
If
Instead
the...
of allowing them to continue on their different path?
Well, by definition, the minority, if it's not an ethnic minority, a minority on the basis of a scripted group, but a programmatic minority, that's part of the definition of this situation. That the programmatic minority in the country could be a programmatic majority in that part of the country.
Yeah, I'm not talking about the elite. I'm talking about like actually discrimination against.
Yeah, well, that's the classic reason to resist in American history, for example, states' rights, because states' rights were famously the instrument of oppression. So that's why I say this right of divergence has to be vetted politically and judicially to be sure that it's not the instrument of oppression. It's dangerous. So in this story about politics, there are dangers on every side, right? So, and the underlying principle is the one adduced by the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead when he said, the business of the future is to be dangerous. So that's the central idea. Yes?
I'm struggling, I guess, counter to this idea, which I like, which is that I feel like the information and the learning that we are going through right now is really centralized. And you see like local news being really affected where people aren't really getting the local perspective. And so the idea of the echo chamber and how that would affect the different experiments. Do you have any like thoughts on how to improve that or why that maybe wouldn't be a concern? Because I feel like right now culturally is really the divide more so than policy or any other major driver.
And what conclusion do you infer from that?
I'm still thinking about that, but I think one of the issues or potential solutions would be just to have more referenda, more activity. Then if something doesn't work, we can learn from that experience and iterate. But I just feel like lots of times, at least in our society at the moment, there's not a lot of policy involved. I mean, some parties don't have a platform right now.
Well, I think that there's this frustrated expression of diversity, right? Because if the diversity is not enacted, we don't really know what it is. If it's an idea or a prejudice or something looming in the air. So I think we have to try things out practically in order to know what they really are. Otherwise, we don't know what they are. I think that's the basic temper behind this proposal regarding central and local. And I think that accords with the American. That's why I think this is what they should focus on first, re-energizing the, things are not what they seem like. Take the United States. All the Republican governors are experimenting with their local industrial policies. Everyone is trying to have his little Silicon Valley. It's absurd because these are like Potemkin villages, right? They're not for real. But it's better, it's interesting, and they're going to fail, and sometimes the failure will lead to something else. And that's a more fertile source of popular enlightenment than this battle of prejudices in the dark, right? We put on the lights, we try something out clearly, decisively, and then we see what we think of it. And things aren't what they appear to be. So take, for example, the state of Utah. It's a one-party state. It's governed by the Republican Party, and it's controlled by the Mormon Church. It has the most favorable Gini coefficient in the United States. Least inequality. Most solidarity. And it's, on its own account, the second happiest state in the United States. The happiest, of course, being the state of Hawaii. So I think reality is always more interesting and more surprising than these preconceptions. So if they want to try things out, let them try things out. They have a vast set of advantages, of which the greatest is a high level of social capital, of solidarity. And that's the wealth of the country, yes.
How do you deal with independentist aspirations in that moment?
Well, I think it's, it can result in a secessionist aspiration. I'm not saying it can't. But I don't think that in these countries, if they become more tolerant of divergence, that's the natural result. So it's not, do they feel that in order to be themselves, they have to cut the link with their historical partners or not? The more freedom you give them to experiment without leaving the country, maybe the more reason they'll have to want to remain in the country. But who knows? I mean, there is that risk that you could feed secessionism. But it would seem to me to be an unlikely outcome in most instances. It could be, especially if there's a long historical background for a secessionist aspiration. But secession, of course, has many costs. The diminishment of power, become a tiny place in the world. I think people generally don't want that. But you're right, it's a risk, it's a bet.
can be, that
It can
aspiration
be.
can be captured by specific political groups that may not be working in the best interest of their people. I mean, their people may not want to become a tiny state in the world stage, but maybe a political elite that manages to capture that experimentation.
Yes, of course, I can understand that. That would be possible. And of course, I haven't said whether secession would be tolerated or not. It could still be a principle of the state that it would allow divergence so long as divergence does not become secession. And there's no reason why that couldn't be part of the arrangement. It is part of the arrangement in most of the world. I mean, the United Kingdom exceptionally admitted the possibility of secession in the way in which it organized the Scottish vote. But it didn't have to do that. And I think that most unitary states in the world would not do that. Now, there's one final thing I want to say about this question of politics, and it goes back to the issue that was raised about the new constituency. So I said, how would a growth miracle happen in the world now, in these large countries, like India and China? Well, China has already had a growth miracle of a way. Indonesia and Brazil, Turkey and Nigeria. Has these two elements. There has to be a dissident elite that seizes power. In the name of a productivist and nationalist idea. And secondly, there has to be a change in the orientation of the popular majority. So the popular majority has to be persuaded to go beyond its subjective petty bourgeois orientation in the conventional form. Conventional form is isolated, archaic family business. That doesn't produce the conditions for a growth miracle in any country now. And it's an inadequate solution even for the individual or the individual family. So the underlying aspiration is to a modest prosperity and independence. But the particular form that that aspiration takes is then the attraction of this isolated family business model. So this is obviously a large struggle of consciousness, because I think that ideologically the central aspiration is the division between right and left is not the division between shallow freedom and shallow equality. That's the ideological controversy that exists today. We would have to reinvent that. And how do we reinvent the division between right and left? We would say there are two criteria for what makes a progressive progressive. The first is that he doesn't accept the established institutional arrangements as the insurpassable horizon of his ideas and of his actions. So the present organization of the market, the present organization of democracy, that frontier has to be capable of being crossed, transgressed. That's the first criteria. The conservative is the one who says, absent a war or ruin, the existing institutional arrangements are the frontier. Everything else is a dream, impractical. The second criterion for division between right and left is that The progressive is the one who thinks it's not natural for human life to be small. The conservative belief is it's natural for human life to be small, but there is an elite of entrepreneurs, heroes, geniuses, saints who are exempt from this fate of belittlement. The majority can temporarily be released from the fate of belittlement when there's war, the terrible devotions of war. And then they have a taste of greatness combined with slaughter. And that makes them happy. We know it makes them happy. We know that for a fact. Because, for example, in the Second World War, rates of suicide and depression fell precipitously in all the belligerent powers and rose again dramatically as soon as universal peace was reestablished. A human being can only be happy if he forgets himself and if he's driven into something larger than himself. So the conservatives think this situation is natural. The progressives think it's not natural. It's not natural for human life to be small. We can all become bigger. We can aspire to a bigger life, a higher life, with more intensity, with broader scope, with greater capabilities, provided that we become bigger together. We ascend, but we must ascend together to ascend at all. That's the second difference between the progressive and the conservative. So that's what's lying behind these ideas of the alternative market order and the alternative politics. And of course, stated as a philosophical doctrine, it has no power. So it has to live through the tangible forms, which are the things we're discussing here. And it seems to me that this transformation of consciousness is slow, but dramatic, decisive, subterranean. And it's what's moving these things on the surface. And at what point in this, then, does the reinvention of politics occur? I think primarily not at the first point. First, there has to be a struggle over the lift-up, the practical lift-up. The shortcut that we believed in until now, conventional industry, is no longer working anywhere in the world. So we need the other one. And then we think, what would be the alternative? The alternative would be an inclusive form of the new vanguard, the knowledge economy. But that alternative is unavailable. Where the knowledge economy exists, it exists only as a set of exclusive fringes. It doesn't exist in an inclusive form. So then there's a struggle over making it inclusive. And then after that struggle begins, after it's established in national politics, then in relation to it begins a struggle to reinvent democracy, to deepen it, so that we don't have to choose between the porous, captured, weak state of low-energy democracy and the vanguardist dictatorship. So this sets us then for our discussion next week and for your discussion, your conversation in the final class. Continue next week. Sure, can we say tomorrow?
Yeah, what time tomorrow?
Tomorrow I end my class at 3. Tomorrow at 3 I'll be in my office at 3:05 or something.
Okay,
Okay.
I will be there. And I read your two-books, Knowledge Economy and the Democracy Realized I still have to read, but okay, when you said we need a war economy with that award, that's I very much agree with you, and I love Mariana Mazzucato as well.
Okay,
Yeah, I'm just wondering, I have too many ideas for the final for this.
okay,
Thank you.
very good.
I'll see you tomorrow. Sure.
So you were speaking to me today, you were available in the office, are we till 6? You said after the class you will be available.
Yeah, I have to be home at 4, but I'll be in my office for about 20 minutes now.
Okay, so I'll just take 5 minutes, that's all.
Sure.
Dictatorship, no, it's not different.
You mean the publication in American Affairs? You mean the essay in
Yeah,
American
that's the
Affairs?
one, yeah.
No. Yes.
Three interlocking sets of ideas we discussed today. We started with selectivity, went into institutional content.
So the 3 ideas were ideas about the problem of selectivity, capture, and the weak state, right? That set of ideas. Then the second set of ideas was the institutional program of high energy democracy. And the third set of ideas is this business about the new constituency for the growth miracles. So what are, in other words, who are these economic and political alternatives for? Who are they for? And the claim is they're for this mass of poor people who are the subject of petty bourgeoisie.